more than just places of burial. I mean, I think we can imagine in our own society, the dead are buried in cemeteries, and often those are considered sort of a place of the dead, and one might go there to think about the dead, or even to visit the dead, or to memorialize the dead, but then they are rather separate from the rest of daily life. There's a suggestion that in Western Europe at this time, the sort of the Neolithic period, that's not necessarily the way the dead were thought about. And one archaeological trace of that is this distinction that this slide is showing us between what archaeologists refer to as primary versus secondary burials. In the lower image, you can see what we call primary burials, and in each of these cases, this isn't a site from Europe. I believe this is actually at Çatalhöyük, but as an example, archaeologists could reconstruct the sequence of events here. Somebody dug a hole. They placed this body into the hole, and they filled the dirt back up. And really the next thing that happened there was that archaeologists came and removed the dirt. And that burial lay undisturbed for all that intervening period of time. All the bones are placed pretty much as they would have been when the individual was alive. And you can contrast that with the image of what's going on up here in the second image, in the secondary burial image. And you've got sort of a skull here. I think this is part of a pelvis here, another skull right here, and then a whole bunch of long bones. These are leg bones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You don't have, and then one leg bone going sort of perpendicular underneath all the rest of this. We don't have that many leg bones in our body, and if we did, they wouldn't all be lying right next to each other, right? No one is ever going to be fit into that position while their body is intact. What's happened here is that this burial, the last time people would touch these bones before archaeologists uncovered them, the bones were already disarticulated, meaning they're not put together in the same way they would have been when the individuals were alive. They're disarticulated. This is going to happen in a number of different reasons, in a number of different ways. It might be that the body was buried in one place as a primary burial, and then after a few weeks, months, years, decades, it was excavated up again in the past by past people, and then the bones were moved around and finally buried in this place here. Sometimes the bones are defleshed in other ways. The flesh can be removed through a process called excarnation, which is where they are left exposed to the elements, and birds and animals sort of eat the bits and pieces. This is something that's done in a number of different cultures, but even presently, as a way of removing the flesh, the sort of rotting off part, and getting to the bones, which seem much more permanent and seem to be a much more effective way of memorializing and also keeping the dead with us. A lot of the burials in these megalithic tombs are often secondary burials, and in even more than that, the bones often have what you might call polish from handling. So you can imagine if there's any kind of an object that you have in your house and your family that's been handed down from person to person to person, but still actually gets used. It's probably got parts on it. The parts that get touched have got a sort of a polish or a shine to them. They've been worn away in a certain way. And you can imagine this also, you get this in very old buildings sometimes with, 300-year-old doorknobs that are still used 10 times a day, or stairs that have hundreds of people walking up and down them. They get a sort of a polish on them from repeated touch and use. Some of the bones that we uncover in megalithic tombs in Western Europe have this polish on them as well. And so we can actually suggest that for many people at this time, the dead were not necessarily gone. They were still very much a part of social life. This is particularly interesting if you think about the possible connections between hierarchy that we've been talking about and this ongoing relationship with the dead. So, the previous king or chief may have died, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's no longer going to be taking part in the decisions of the community. People, perhaps the current rulers, perhaps spiritual rulers, perhaps even just regular people, might go into these tombs, or into some of them in some cases, and interact with the bones of their ancestors, interact with their great-grandmother, who was the one who really knew the best time to plant crops, and ask advice. Is this the right time now? Are we going to have an early spring, or do we need to wait longer? the bones are actually picked up and handled as part of this, and this is a regular part of daily life for people in this context. Of course, you can't talk about Western European Neolithic without talking about Stonehenge. Stonehenge, of course, is actually just one of a number of different sites that we could call henges in general, henges or henge monuments. Henges are structures that clearly have ritual significance, but they're also more complicated. They are connected to a whole landscape and to a number of different social and political issues. This is just an example to show that there are more henges out there than just Stonehenge. Each of these circles could be called a henge or a henge monument. This is not at Stonehenge, the Salisbury Plain. I believe this is in Ireland, actually. I'm not entirely sure. But, many different other kinds of constructions would have been a part of these. Sometimes there are what are referred to as rows, long straight lines of stones or posts, wooden posts, which of course have been rotted away but are recoverable by archaeologists as features, or mounds, sometimes right near henges, sometimes separately, burial mounds, among others, all of which would have been part of a very complicated ritual landscape, and all of which would have required a great deal of specialist knowledge to make. Here's an old cartoon that it looks like Stonehenge on fire. It says, "Well, so much for Woodhenge." Well, actually, it seems likely that these kind of henge monuments have a very long history in Western Europe. They certainly exploded in number, in complexity, and in difficulty to build after farming. In those 2,000 years after farming became the regular way, people got what they needed to survive. But some of them have very long histories that we'll touch on that go back well into the hunter-gatherer period. And in fact, Stonehenge probably had a wooden precursor on that site. Many different henges have been uncovered by archaeologists, many of which were actually made out of wood exclusively and don't survive other than as features in the ground. Apart from being rather impressive things that the descendants of the builders could market as tourist sites, henges probably had a number of really important functions. They, of course, were the centers and the areas of focus for ritual activity, the details of which rituals are largely lost, but we can also suggest a number of things about those rituals and how they connected to the rest of social life, because ritual and religion, of course, is deeply connected to the rest of social life. One of the things that we could say about them is that many of them are connected to observable phenomenon about the world around them. One of the most common ways is actually that many of them are aligned with celestial and solar events. There's actually an area of study called archaeoastronomy. It's one of those things that sounds like it's fake. It sounds like it's something that you should write a popular presentations research paper about and debunk. But no, actually, there really are people out there who are archaeoastronomers. There are archaeologists who specialize in astronomical phenomenon, or astronomers who specialize in archaeological evidence about astronomical phenomenon. This has nothing to do with space aliens. What these folks are doing is that they're paying attention to where the stars and the sun's alignments would have been at different times in history. And they do move very slightly, the stars do, and of course the sun moves through the sky in a yearly way as well as a daily way. And what they've determined is that with remarkable accuracy in many cases, a lot of these henge monuments are aligned with some of these features. So for instance, what you're looking at now is kind of a generic reconstruction of what one might have looked like, where it's aligned with the midsummer sunrise, so that on the morning of the longest day, the summer solstice in the middle of the summer in June, the sun at dawn rises exactly over the heel stone, a sort of an indicator stone, and shines directly along a very predicted path into the middle of the henge, into the middle of the monument. So one possibility here is that these are really practical calendars, right? That if you are a farmer in the Neolithic without your iPad to tell you what the day is, it's kind of difficult to keep track of exactly when you should be sowing your crops. Sometimes things warm up early. You might get a warm spell in February, and if you're not paying attention, you could sow all your crops. They could start sprouting. It could go back to being, a bitter cold March. Everything freezes and dies, and then you're in big trouble because you don't have any more seed to sow. So keeping track of when one should sow and when one should reap in order to get enough food to live is a really important thing. To touch this back to our big concept map, remember that paying attention to where the stars are aligned and exactly how far the sun has moved down or up in the sky on certain days is a pretty complicated thing, and it probably requires a specialist, a person who would have understood these things in either a religious context or a farming context, and been able to direct the construction of these sites. So now we've got an architect who has to design and tell you how it is you can move those giant stones around, which is not, by the way, nearly so much of a mystery to archaeologists as all of the late-night TV shows would like you to believe. You need a specialist archaeologist, or excuse me, a specialist architect to direct that work. You might need a specialist ruler to control the resources for that work, to raise a tax to use the food to feed the workers who are spending their time on this rather than on growing their own food. But now you also need an astronomer or someone to tell you when the sun is doing what in the sky. So again, a really important specialist set of observations being made here. Touching back on Newgrange in Ireland, just wanted to reveal that henges like Stonehenge are not the only constructions that are built with this level of precision and this much work. Remember that light box that I talked about here over the door in Newgrange on the image to the left? That box is placed very, very specifically and very precisely, and in fact, what it is there for is that I believe it's at the moment of dawn on the midsummer sun, the day of the longest day of the year, the sun rises such that it shines directly through that spot and for a few minutes lights up the absolute deepest, darkest corner in the back of the passageway of Newgrange. So even though when you're inside that tomb, it feels very much like you're in another world. Even with modern-day electric lighting, it is very dark. Seems very distant and difficult to get to the outside from there. You are sort of surrounded by the world of the dead, and even as a modern tourist, you can feel that. I certainly did there, and not in a particularly spiritual sense. But for just those few minutes every year, the sun brightly lights that place up. And if you're curious about this, it really must have been a spectacular experience to the pre-modern people. I think it's a pretty spectacular experience now. If you're curious about it, they actually let about 10 or 12 people a year be there for that moment. You have to enter a lottery and be one of very few out of very many to win that lottery to get your chance to go there, and then you have to get all the way to Ireland. But it might be a fun thing to try to do sometime. For our purposes for the class, the really key element here is that this is another element of it's both ideological. It's certainly clearly religious in some sense, whatever that meant at the time, but it's also connected to economics and food production, as somebody else is paying for this work. Somebody is creating the food so that the people who do all of this work can be those specialists, can be those laborers, and a lot of extra effort is going into this work, where at least the burial part of it only benefits a few people out of the many who might do the work. Whether there are spiritual elements to that is another element that is a little more open to discussion, whether the spiritual benefits are for the broader community here. So a lot of really interesting social issues going on here. Going back to Stonehenge for just a second and thinking about those ideological, those religious ideas for a moment. I mentioned before that Stonehenge is just part of a much broader landscape, and here's a map of what that landscape looks like. As a tourist who goes there now, you don't see most of this. Most of this is are archaeologically recovered features which you can't see on the surface. They've been filled in, and the fields are being used to grow crops again. But if you look sort of at a broader area, several kilometers around, and here's Stonehenge in the middle of this this map, you have all these little dots here are other important Neolithic period monuments, other henges, and lots of them are burials. Some of them are linear features, like a famous feature called the Avenue, which seems to be a sort of a processional way to Stonehenge. And then on the other side here, you have a different set of things where it looks like people were actually living. Here is actually a site which is known as Woodhenge. It's a henge monument, a slightly different kind of henge monument that was made of wood. It was recovered archaeologically. But the bigger site here is called Durrington Walls, and it appears to have been a sort of a walled settlement that people were living in about the same time as sort of part of Stonehenge's history. The ideas of an archaeologist named Michael Parker Pearson, who's the archaeologist who's been doing most of the recent work on Stonehenge and on the area around Stonehenge, is that this actually sets up an entire landscape that is divided up between the zone of the living over here at Durrington Walls and the zone of the dead over here at Stonehenge, and all of the burial mounds and burials that are associated with it and are within a couple of kilometers with it. I've got a little video here where Mike Parker Pearson sort of talks about this.
Stonehenge is at the centre of a long-lived ceremonial landscape. One of the most mysterious of finds was made under the car park of what is currently the visitor centre, and found to be pits that had originally held giant timber posts. The radiocarbon dates on these posts show that they were put up nearly 10,000 years ago. So this comes from an era when people generally weren't building monuments. This is a time when, in fact, Britain has no monuments. So to find these right next to where Stonehenge would be constructed is really very interesting, and it suggests that there was something about that spot which had been known, possibly forgotten and rediscovered over many thousands of years before Stonehenge's construction. We think we know what that may be because in 2008 our excavations along the avenue, the ceremonial approach into Stonehenge, which is aligned on the solstices, we discovered that the banks of that avenue were actually put on top of what seemed to be natural landforms. So ridges, and in between them wide and deep fissures caused by periglacial activity in the last ice age. If we're right about this, what we're looking at is there being some kind of a natural feature in the land which actually lines up with the sun's maximum extents at sunrise and sunset, midsummer sunrise, midwinter sunset. So it may well be that these were seen as somehow of cosmological significance, where the earth and the heavens came together.
So we've got the beginnings of farming in Western Europe in the Neolithic, associated with a lot of these kinds of constructions, both physical and social, that are going to be a little bit different than anything had been previously. We've got large marks on the landscape, marking some things as belonging to one group of people and not others. We've got constructions that would have required the concerted effort of a lot of people, and both to plan them, the people who are aware of these kinds of solar phenomenon. We've got a lot of control and organization of people to bring these stones in. Stonehenge stones were brought in from Wales, 100 miles away. We've got a lot of effort going into this construction that is a lot of people not creating their own food during the time when they're doing it. So we have both specialists and other farmers creating enough food for the workers to survive during that period of time. And we've got interactions with the natural world too. We've got the sun itself and these natural geologic features that Mike Parker Pearson and his crew thinks are associated with Stonehenge. This is a group that within a few generations before farming was deeply familiar with the world around them, but those understandings definitely have changed over the last couple of thousand years, where they began farming and modifying their landscape in a lot of different ways. Does this represent, as we've got on the screen here, social differentiation? It may be partly, and not just, is the answer, and it certainly wouldn't have looked precisely like this sort of schematic representation of Western medieval Europe, nor would it look precisely like what we've got today, but we're definitely dealing with social phenomenon that are a lot more complicated than they were previously.